Snow White and the Frozen Dwarfs. Snow White and the Frozen Dwarfs. On August 24, 2006, an International Astronomical Union adopted fixed definitions for various objects in the solar system. Snow White, otherwise known as 2007 OR10, is a dwarf planet about 13 billion kilometers from the Sun. Its orbit, canted by almost 31 degrees to the plane of the ecliptic, is so large that it was closest to the Sun in 1856 and will not reach its furthest point until 2130, taking more than 550 years to revolve. Snow White joins many other icy worlds so far from the Sun that it would be hard to pick out that luminary from the star field. It is in similar orbit with its sister dwarf Eris, 2003 UB313, within a region occupied by so-called trans-Neptunian objects, TNO, or Kuiper Belt objects, KBO. Astronomers Kenneth Edgeworth and Gerald Kuiper proposed a Kuiper Belt theory in 1951. In 1992, the as-yet unnamed 1992 QB1 was discovered, confirming the idea that a group of frigid objects beyond Neptune was in orbit around the Sun. Dwarf planets are also part of the TNO designation, trans-Neptunian, although they are in a subclass by themselves. In 2006, a controversial vote was cast at a meeting of astronomers in Prague that provided a way to classify various celestial bodies. 4 relevant resolutions were proposed. Resolution 5A, definition of a planet. Resolution 5B, definition of a classical planet. Resolution 6A, definition of a Pluto-class objects. 6B, definition of Plutonian objects. According to the vote, the planet, in quotation, is a celestial body that orbits the Sun, has nearly round shape, and has cleared its orbit of extraneous debris. Another classification was added to the terms used by astronomers: dwarf planet. A dwarf planet is essentially something that looks like a planet but is not a planet. Pluto is now considered a dwarf planet, as is the asteroid Ceres, along with an aforementioned Eris and Snow White, Haumea, Makemake, Sedna, Quoar, and Orcus are also likely to be dwarf planets. Pluto's moon, Charon, would also fit if it were not a moon.
I can't hear any show yet.
There are dozens more that await further investigation.
Okay.
Pluto is an intriguing planet, isn't it?
Yeah, cool, yeah.
Immanuel Kant's theory that the solar system was born from a dusty cloud of gas, or nebula, floating in space, is known as the nebular hypothesis. As Kant suggested, the cloud contracted because gravity drew the cloud's particles together into clumps. As they grew, the clumps became more attractive, finally accumulating into a mass. The gravitational force became so strong that it compressed the mass into a hot ball, rotating with the cloud's original angular momentum. It gathered more and more matter until nuclear fusion reaction ignited it, giving birth to the Sun, a structure called an accretion disk, circling its equatorial plane. The accretion disk is said to have extended beyond the orbit of Neptune. According to scientists, eddies of matter formed in the spinning ring of dust and gas. Those eddies grew larger, slowly sucking in more and more particles until hundreds of millions of impacts from nebular condensates gradually form the planets. The Kuiper Belt, as well as the theoretical Oort cloud, were supposed to be holding areas for the remaining material that did not condense into planets or dwarf planets. In a previous picture of the day, another class of solar system object called centaurs were discussed. It was noted that they are what could be called cometary asteroids and come in several colors: reddish-brown, blue, green, and brownish-yellow. As suggested by this writer, the centaur objects could be colored because they were ejected by the gas giant planets, the colors corresponding to the colors of their parents. An interesting characteristic of the various dwarf planets is that they, too, are colorful. Snow White, contrary to its name, is reddish in color, like its sister Haumea. Pluto itself is brownish-yellow, while Eris is green. In a plasma cosmogony hypothesis, the stars are formed when cosmic Birkeland currents twist around one another, creating Z-pinch regions that compress the plasma into a solid. Laboratory experiments have shown that such compression zones are the most likely candidates for star formation and not collapsing nebulae. When stars are born, they are probably under extreme electrical stress. In that case, they will split into two or more daughter stars, thereby equalizing their electrical potential. The fission process is repeated in further electrical disturbances by flaring red dwarfs and gas giant planets ejecting rocky and icy planets, moons, comets, asteroids, and meteorites. Planetary systems may also be acquired over time by electrical capture of independent interstellar bodies such as dim brown dwarf stars. That seems the best explanation for our fruit salad of a solar system. Wall Thornhill. When New Horizons arrives at Pluto in July 2015, electric universe theorists expect a nebular hypothesis to be falsified again, as it has in the past. 99% of the universe is plasma, so the conclusions derived from the hypothesis are not connected with real observations. Stephen Smith. I have read that before. A long farewell to the Big Bang model of cosmology. Summary. The article deals with the background to the failure of physics in the 20th century, and why it is so important to work out a new physical worldview. The cosmos is to be understood as an open system, not as an inflating ball. This knowledge has a direct bearing on the understanding of the sun and thus also on its reproduction in the laboratory. It can possibly provide us with a clean energy source for the future with which we can achieve the energy transition from fossil carbon age to the hydrogen age. Cosmology is the study of the world, of the origin, development, and structure of the cosmos. If we allow the cosmos to develop, we cannot know anything about the origin. The current structure, however, can be seen, but inferring the initial state from the current structure only works with time-independent processes, such as a Markov process. Since a time can be reversed there, this is not possible with a development process. Every engineer knows that you cannot deduce from the final state to the beginning. Just as little as you can still recognize the horse-drawn carriage in a modern automobile. The assumption of an initial state belongs to the realm of belief in a religion. Besides, what time is valid in the cosmos? Time is relative, so you have no absolute start. Religions are static, but our knowledge grows dynamically with our failure and our successes in mastering nature. In short, the development of technology, the technical replication of elements of nature, is the ultimate proof of our understanding of how they work. How can we then succeed in reconciling belief in religion with science? Our faith ends where knowledge begins. Fewer and fewer functions of nature are expected of gods today, and more functions are recognized, and thus become the responsibility of mankind. 100 years ago, Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, Georges Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, was inspired by the belief that this reconciliation might succeed because at the beginning of the 20th century, there were two currents in the Catholic Church. One wanted a liberalization of religion, the other wanted to reconstruct old power structures, as it is expressed in the encyclical of Pope Pius X. Of course, the authority to interpret the sky was one of the most important goals. It was not about the unreserved exploration of the cosmos. Rather, it was about the integration of scientific discoveries into the thought structure of Christian doctrine of creation, whereby the scientists consciously found support and recognition that best corresponded to this idea. They were added in 1936 by Pope Pius XI through a newly founded Pontifical Academy of Sciences. On the other hand, at the beginning of the 20th century, electromagnetism was so well researched that it could be transferred to technical applications. However, the application was still based on a large-scale charge separation by means of mechanical power, largely by burning fossil fuels. At the same time, two worldviews competed: the electromagnetic of James Clerk Maxwell and the mechanical gravitational worldview of Isaac Newton. While the electromagnetic worldview of the 19th century brought us from the energy industry to microelectronics and into an unprecedented level of prosperity, the advances on the basis of Newton's gravity seem rather modest. The question of why the moon and the space probes are not on the Earth falling back but swinging into orbit cannot be explained mechanically satisfactorily. Even though the worldview that was developed at the Solvay conferences from 1911 is still adhered to today. Many discoveries have been made since the beginning of space travel history that do not fit this picture. We have to ask why this is so. Figure 1. Einstein and the Pontifical Academy. You have to know that philosophy at the turn of the 20th century was shaped by subjective idealism. The mysticism of the virgin birth was promoted by Lemaitre and replaced by a mathematical mysticism. Paul Dirac was one of the most prominent exponents of this mystification, who, although an avid atheist, was a member of the newly founded Pontifical Academy of Sciences from the beginning until his death. Mathematics took the place of religious belief. Remember, in the ancient times, the only place that scientists were allowed to let their minds soar was in mathematics, that the church did not feel threatened. Mathematics took the place of religious belief, and with its symmetry as an expression of beauty, it is more important to have beauty in your equations than agreement with the experiment, Paul Dirac once formulated his credo in Scientific American. The Rock even spoke in the context of God, whom he considered being a highly brilliant mathematician. Wolfgang Pauli once put it, "Our friend Dirac has a religion, and its motto is 'There is no God,' and Dirac is his prophet." He became the creator of a number of physical phantoms, the existence of which in some cases has even been allegedly proven, such as the spin from the Dirac equation and the neutrino in the radioactive decay of the neutron. So it came about that relativity theory and quantum mechanics emerged as intellectual fantasy products and were recognized as established theories. In a conversation with Einstein, Heisenberg admitted that one does not yet know how the mathematical formulation of quantum mechanics relates to natural language, because no one would talk about the experiments with natural language. The Dirac equations of quantum mechanics are based on a special theory of relativity, the basis of which is the Lorentz transformation of Maxwell's equations, whose sole purpose for Einstein was to symmetrize these equations. This symmetrization is a physically completely nonsensical operation, since it destroys the character of the equations, namely to describe the propagation of electromagnetic waves. As a second stroke of genius, Albert Einstein invented the curvature of space through gravity because he could not explain how celestial bodies were kept in their orbit. Einstein himself must have taken it as a joke because he confessed to his friend Paul Ehrenfest, "I've already done something wrong in the theory of gravity, which puts me at risk of being interned in a madhouse." Although anyone who knows something about physics and geometry knows that curvatures can only be observed on surfaces, and that light rays are influenced in their direction by diffraction due to optical effects. Whole generations of physicists seem to have no longer learned the difference between a surface and a space. Physically, a surface presents itself as a phase boundary between two different states of matter. Furthermore, they seem to have forgotten that time is never independent of the path. This is why there cannot be a four-dimensional world, but there can be a process in which there are sequences of states. Only surfaces can be curved. Space-time is space and time, not a four-dimensional space. Time, in contrast, is a number of motion cycles that are counted and are synchronized with the movement of the Earth around its axis. Unlike the path on which it is based, it has no direction. Where one begins to count the cycles is left to the discretion of the observer. Consequently, the time is relative. Einstein once remarked that time is what clocks indicate, with which he expressed the relativity of time. Relativity means that a relation, i.e., a relationship, is established between the observer and the observed phenomenon, no more and no less. Therefore, appearances can be perceived differently from different points of view, although they themselves are unchanged. So if you perceive an object in the distance as smaller, it is not due to physics, but to the optics of your perception. The Lorentz transformation does the same with Maxwell's equations, which is why this figure shows time and distance distortions. As Einstein said, "You can fool of yourself with mathematics. Physics have learned to solve equations, but apparently they have not been taught what they mean. Since Dirac and Heisenberg, visual perception wasn't trained when I was studying physics half a century ago. So physicists tried using mathematics to construct an illusory world for which they were looking for evidence in reality. However, new phantoms have to be invented, because this leads to contradictions again and again. Then further evidence was sought in reality without being bothered by the fact that this evidence had already been used up for other phenomena. We have recently started calling something like this alternative facts. Mathematics is a language intended to describe real things and appearances. Alternative facts can also be invented with a language. One of the most spectacular examples of this alternative facts is the black hole, which repeatedly stimulates people's fantasies. Einstein's equation of general relativity has a pole, which is interpreted as a point of maximum gravity, and should be strong, that it would not even let light escape. The belief was triggered because they could not explain why galaxies do not obey Newton's equation of gravitation, but must contain much larger forces in order to explain their rotational speeds at the edges. To resolve this contradiction, the black hole, dark matter, and dark energy were invented. But these terms do not say anything more than something invisible and mysterious exists that cannot be described with the known laws of physics. Really, it can't be disproved either, so therefore they really shouldn't be allowed. According to Newton's particle theory, light would consist of photons be trapped in a black hole and would be deflected in strong gravitational fields. We know light deflection is an optical phenomenon resulting from wave diffraction or refraction at phase boundaries between an optically thinner and an optically denser medium. This has nothing to do with gravity, but with the optical density of the medium in the vicinity of plasma balls. In terms of radiation, black is an absorption range of around 400 nanometers to 780 nanometers. Why should this area be preferred by gravity? Or should this phenomenon be extended to the entire electromagnetic spectrum? That would mean that in the vicinity of a black hole, not even thermal radiation should occur. In other words, since we can only learn something about the existence of cosmic objects through electromagnetic radiation, their existence would not be verifiable, because forces, if they can be measured, only reveal direction and strength, but not the nature of their origin. And I would think that electromagnetism is really the only thing they have to measure. What else is there? The decades-long dispute between Leonard Susskind and Stephen Hawking turned on the question of whether information can be retained in a black hole was also spectacular. This question is pretty academic and becomes easier to understand if you remember that light contains information about its light source in the form of a spectrum. If this information is not retained, it means that the light source is no longer lit, i.e., does not emit any electromagnetic radiation. But as long as charges cross a force field, they absorb or emit radiation and thus information. That would mean, however, that the entropy would decrease, since the order would increase with the decrease in the movement of the atoms. This would contradict the second law of thermodynamics in a closed system. The dispute is recorded in the book The Black Hole War my battle with Stephen Hawking to make the world safe for quantum mechanics. This dispute continued for many years and ended in 2014 with Hawking's admission that there were no black holes. Notwithstanding this, the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded for the discovery that the formation of black holes is a robust prediction of general relativity. You rub your eyes in amazement. Has the black hole war and its end eluded the Nobel Committee? Or was it celebrated astrophysics star Hawking posthumously disqualified as a dabbler? No, the general theory of relativity has become the foundation of the Catholic worldview. And what would happen if this foundation would crumble? How much research capacity would then be free for other tasks? The cosmos is an open system. Pope Francis himself undermined this very foundation when he wrote in paragraph 79 of his 2015 encyclical, "In this universe made up of open systems that communicate with one another, we can discover innumerable forms of relationship and participation." However, this statement would contradict physicists who understand the universe and black holes as closed systems, because the theory never spoke of an exit. According to Reverend Lemaitre, the universe expands. Now we know that information has something to do with
in
entropy.
3 minutes.
And according to
Ilja
Prigogine, this applies to the change entropy in the overall open system.
ds system equals dsInp, ds out plus d sind equals dsex plus d sind.
For a black hole, ds out equals 0 because by definition it does not release any entropy in the form of radiation. This means that the total entropy change of a black hole is
ds system greater than 0.
ds system greater than 0 would always be positive. The black hole could not cool down at all, since the total entropy would not decrease at any time. This would prevent the mass from being able to contract and would be the prerequisite for gravity to grow in a small area. Thermodynamics disturbs the beauty of the symmetry of the equations, which is why relativists and quantum mechanics want nothing to do with it. For the above equation, Prigogine was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1977. Now, chemistry, like physics, belongs to the natural sciences. It is assumed that the knowledge of this neighboring discipline should have been incorporated into physics over the past 4 decades. But what is then in the center of a galaxy if there is no black hole? Huge electrical currents flow in the center of a galaxy that in turn generate huge magnetic fields. These then cause charge separation. This is why we see plasma currents emerging from the center of certain galaxies, which is typical for a plasmoid. Unlike a black hole, a plasmoid is an open system. After the violation of Maxwell's equations by the symmetry fans among physicists who say there are no electrical currents in the cosmos, black spots are rather retouched in the images of galaxies at the points of highest luminance to mark a suspected black hole. Recently, a photo montage of recordings of large radio telescopes of galaxy nuclei has been in the press. If you know that gas molecules radiate in the radio range and have learned that molecules break down through ionization, it soon becomes clear that molecules are not preserved in the hot glowing center of a galaxy. So, the center in the radio range, which is glaring in visible light, comparatively has to emit less radiation. This is how this photo comes out, which depicts a situation that is interpreted completely differently from what it tells the expert. There are other examples in the recent history of physics where research results are supposed to support the untenable theories around the Big Bang model of cosmology. These include the alleged proof of gravitational waves from the collision of black holes or neutron stars, or the proof of the existence of the so rare God particle Higgs boson, that the mass should pass to the other particles. Obviously, such people have forgotten that mass is nothing more than an unaccountable amount of particles. The term mass, therefore, becomes superfluous in the area of individual elementary particles. It is worthwhile to take a closer look in science as well as in other areas where there is no control. You always have to expect to be cheated, especially since experiments are so expensive today that independent control is no longer possible in a timely manner. Unfortunately, general knowledge in the natural sciences, and especially in physics, has steadily declined over the past few decades, which is a fundamental disadvantage for a nation that, like ours, Germany, is dependent on education because it has no natural resources and which, under the influence of climate change, has to transform its economy towards clean energy generation. This requires an understanding of how the cosmos, and especially the sun, work as an open system. An understanding here means the construction of a fusion generator that delivers so much entropy from the fusion of atomic nuclei that a gas turbine can be operated with it. From a thermodynamic point of view, the tokamak principle is obviously based on a wrong approach, namely that of a closed system in which high temperatures can be reached, but not a higher order as required by fusion. But that is a topic for another essay. And I believe this gentleman's name is
Matthias Huffner.
Matthias Huffner. I just don't understand how it is that we're ever going to expand or advance in science when they teach the wrong thing to the people at school. It just confounds me.
Notice the twin dots on the two sides of these crudely crafted stick figures. One instance alone is just a curiosity. But widespread patterns must have an explanation. And other details only accent the irrationality. Recently, an answer to these mysteries came from outside traditional archaeology, from plasma science and laboratory experiments with electric discharge. Plasma scientist Anthony Peratt of Los Alamos Laboratories has shown that these stick forms recorded electrical events in the sky. Something like the northern lights we see today, but 1,000 times more energetic. And he matches the rock art forms precisely to the configurations taken by electric discharge in the laboratory. The rock art images are explained as sheets of intense electric current in the evolution of a plasma discharge. The central column you see in this stylized representation is the axis of the discharge. Wrapped around the axis is a torus or donut-like tubular sheet of charged particles. The observer sees through the transparent formation, champagne glass above, squashed bell shape below, so the plasma density is greatest at the limbs. Drawn in 2 dimensions, the formation matches the stick man carved globally on stone by the thousands. The 2 dots under the stick man's arms are the exceedingly bright, high-energy radiation called synchrotron radiation, emitted from the center of the torus.
Physical snakes. This is political, or it is religious, theocratic, theological propaganda. He's saying, Christianity has arrived, I am in town, there's a new gig, there's a new game in town, and you can just forget about these serpents and the previous races that were here. Their time is over, and the new sun religion, the new solar paradigm has arrived. That is political, or it is religious, theocratic, theological propaganda. He's saying, Christianity has arrived, I am in town, there's a new gig, there's a new game in town, and you can just forget about these serpents and the previous races that were here. Their time is over, and the new sun religion, the new solar paradigm has arrived. That's what it represents. And it implies, of course, that the people of the prehistoric times, before Christianity, not only revered the symbol of the serpent, but were actually known as the serpents. And we'll come to more explanation of why that is a little bit later. Now, even though there's a great wealth coming out of the ancient mythologies of all countries, scientists disagree and speculate that there was no ancient civilizations of any merit in ancient times. But the ancient legends also speak about their own demise, just like the Tuatha De Danann, saying that they came from islands that were destroyed in a great war of the gods and a great calamity of nature. So we have in many of the mythologies of the world this reference to destruction and cataclysm and upheaval. The most famous story, of course, is Noah, the famous patriarch, being literally told by God of a coming flood, and that the whole earth was going to be in tribulation, and that he should build a vessel so that the chosen ones could be saved. But that's not the only area in the scriptures where we read of cataclysm. Yes, there's the deluge, but then we also have the story of the 10 plagues of Egypt. We have the story of the destruction in Sodom and Gomorrah. And we have the story of the walls of Jericho being blasted to pieces. And many other areas through the whole book of Job, there's tumult and cataclysm and stories of great upheaval. In Genesis 6, God is saying, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. Now, from a scientific point of view, what are we told? We're told, yes, we have an ice age. This ice age happened in what we know as the Pleistocene epoch, and before the ice age, there was nothing. Men walked around in skins, and Neanderthal men, hunter-gatherers. No such concept as Atlantis or Lemuria or any other advanced civilization could possibly have existed. So what is the tenets of the official theory? Well, the high priests of geology were of Charles Lyell. He was the exponent of the theory of uniformity. That simply means that through the geological record, nature, evolution, all of these things are incrementally slow, very, very slow movements of development over vast expanses of time. Louis Agassiz, he was the exponent of the glacial theory, exponent of the ice ages, and particularly Professor James Geekie, geology professor at Edinburgh University, a major champion of the ice age theory. And believe me, that's all it is, a theory, as we're about to see. Now, the ice ages are meant to have taken place, geologically speaking, in what is known as the Pleistocene epoch. This is the epoch lasting 2 million years that is housing what we know as the ice age. But Professor James Geekie says, if there is anything more fantastic than Geekie's extravagant theory, it is that it has been lapped up by his successors and by intelligent men who, by logic alone, should be able to denounce it. Yet it is today a dogma. This is Commons Beaumont, one of the most suppressed scholars of all time, talking about Geekie's findings. He says it's unsustainable, simply a dogma. Communist Beaumont goes on to say, the flood, to the world generally a vague and nebulous tradition, really conceals the most appalling visitation, and its ravages in the British Isles and Scandinavian lands may be retraced to more considerable extent by the effects of what geologists term the drift age. It was no mere ice drift, it was a sudden and terribly swift and violent. So Beaumont was one of the great catastrophists. Along with Immanuel Velikovsky, he was a person who decried and did not believe in or subscribe to the uniformitarian philosophy. He understood that we had been visited by tremendously swift cataclysms of the past. And he spent his life trying to refute what Geekie and the uniformitarianists were advancing. And in the fine book, When the Earth Nearly Died, by Allen and Dallaire, they say, it is an astonishing that such an unscientific explanation ever came to be formulated, yet in a short time both it and the concept of immense, thick ice sheets descending from a hypothetical northern mountain system was enthusiastically embraced as virtually established fact. They go on to write, the evidence is perfectly unambiguous. Along with the removal of an ice age, like that which is hitherto commonly envisaged, the evidence suggests that there is something seriously amiss with the last phases of standard geological chronology. Now, these unsustainable theories of ice ages and drift ages has been refuted in the 90s by several authors, not only Allen and Dallaire, but by Michael Cremo in his monumental work Forbidden Archaeology, and more specifically by the Observer magazine scientific writer Robert Milton, who wrote a fine book called Shattering the Myths of Darwin. Now, Clifford Wilson, in his book, The Chariots Still Crash, he says, some dates obtained by other radiometric methods are seriously astray, such as the age of millions of years being attributed to volcanic rocks in Hawaii, which are known to be less than 200 years old. This is reported in the Journal of Geophysical Research. It is known that these lava rocks were actually formed in 1800 and 1801 in Hualai in Hawaii. The potassium-argon dating methods was utilized, and a formation age of 160 million to 3 billion years were given for this rock formation, which was known to be just over 170 years old. This is not an isolated report. Rock samples from 12 volcanoes in Russia and 10 samples from other places around the world, all known to be of recent age, that is, formed within the last 200 years, when dated by the uranium, thorium, lead method, gave ages varying from millions to billions of years. So here's your science for you. But luckily, a lot of these scientific findings are now being seriously refuted, and we need to know about this. Clifford Wilson goes on to say, there is increasing evidence to suggest that those figures of millions of years, which we were given in our childhood, must be put to one side. And indeed they must. But what would happen if they are? What happens if we suddenly start to question these Royal Academy and Royal Society dates and figures and scholarship? Well, then the truth of what might be behind that Pleistocene epoch, I mean, if you concertine the whole 2 million year Pleistocene epoch out of existence, suddenly you have no ice ages, no substantial ice ages, and therefore no great wall between our time and the past. Evidence thus converges from numerous directions to support the conclusion that on the testimony of radiocarbon and other dating techniques, immense physical and climatic changes occurred on Earth some 11,000 years or so ago, when an ice age that probably never existed came to an end, and the apparently uniformitarian regime was abruptly terminated. There you are. That's Allen and Dallaire saying that something happened so much more recently, and it had very little to do with an ice age. Thus, if many of today's highest mountains were much lower when the alleged ice age was reputedly at its zenith, then how did so much ice, if it actually existed, manage to accumulate? Indeed, we can take a step further and ask whether the ice sheets so beloved of the glacialists ever existed at all. Now, these two geologists have discovered that the mountains that are quite high today all over the world were not as high 11,000 years ago. Well, of course, that goes to the heart of the glacialists' theory. You have to have very high peaks in order to have the cold for the ice sheets to be created. But if they actually were being told, then there goes your ice theory right out the window. They go on to say, the time allegedly occupied by the glacial and interglacial episodes of conventional Pleistocene chronology was actually non-existent. Now, how come we have not heard worldwide debate about this book or of Robert Milton's Shattering Myths of Darwinism?
And I think I'm going to read some comments. That sounds like it might be fun, huh?
Idea.
So let's watch one. You pick it. I'm gonna name them, and you pick it. Okay.
Okay.
All right. The Confusion of the Languages, Tower of Babel.
Ooh.
Mercury, Thoth, Odin, and Enki. The Rings of Saturn and Arrival of the Waters. Festival of Lights, Jupiter and Saturn, Saturnalia. Purple Dawn Chronology. In the Beginning, Planet Ages, A Brighter Moon. The Pelestians, A Time Before the Moon. Universe Electric, oh, that's not Velikovsky. Oh, the Pre-Adamite Age and Moon Worship. Deification of the Planets by the Ancients. Giants, Saturn of the Flood and Origin of the Oceans. Worship of Saturn. Nephilim.
I want to hear about the Tower of Babel. I want to know what that how they.
Oh yeah, this is a good one. Yeah, I like this one. Yeah. Hold on, I got a. Man, it's one of the older videos. It's 4x3.
Oh wow! I don't care.
It's okay.
I would love to hear about that.
Yeah, this is back when I just followed the text, mostly. The Confusion of Languages. The sequence of events as presented in the book of Genesis places the catastrophe of Babel next after the deluge. And the whole land was of one language and of one speech. And they said, Let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they will have all one language. Let us go down and confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from the face of the earth. Is that the beginning of the Great Schism? The rabbinical sources explain that the purpose of the tower was to secure a shelter to the city of Babel in case the deluge should occur another time. The men who were before us God has destroyed with a deluge. If he shall think again, fit to be wroth with us, and seek to destroy us even with a deluge, we shall all perish to a man. But come, let us prepare bricks and burn them with fire, and they may withstand the waters, and building them together with asphalt, let us make a high tower, the top of which shall reach to heaven, in order that being delivered from the deluge, we may find safety in the tower. The purpose of the builders is found also in an account of this catastrophe, which the Aborigines of Central America transmitted from generation to generation. Oh boy. Ixtoxtecatl, after narrating the story of the deluge, which brought to a close the first world age, Atanasia, and destroy most of mankind, described the catastrophe, which ended the second age, or Atacanasia, the son of wind. And as men were therefore multiplying, they constructed a very high and strong Zakwali, which means a very high tower, in order to protect themselves when again the second world should be destroyed. At a crucial moment their languages were changed, and as they did not understand one another, they went into different parts of the world. The same author also gives another version of the same catastrophe. When 1,715 years had passed since the deluge, men were destroyed by a violent hurricane, Hurricane, which carried off trees, mountains, houses, and people, great buildings, although many men and women escaped, especially those that were able to take refuge in caves and places where this great hurricane could not reach. Similarly, wrote Gomorrah, circa 1510 to 1560. The wind which occurred at that time was so great and of such force that it overthrew all the buildings and trees and even broke mountains apart. Now, that's got to be some wind, man. Many of the sources which recount the destruction of the Tower of Babel maintain, in close accord with the Mexican account, that the catastrophe was caused by a violent wind. Thus, the Sibyl is said to have prophesied, "When are fulfilled the threats of the great God with which he threatened men, when formerly in an Assyrian land they built a tower, and all were of one speech, and wished to rise even till they climbed unto the starry heaven. Then the immortal raised a mighty wind, and laid upon them strong necessity. For when the wind threw down the mighty tower, then rose among mankind fierce strife and hate. One speech was changed into many dialects, and earth was filled with divers tribes and kings." In the book of Jubilees, it is said that the Lord sent a mighty wind against the tower and overthrew it upon the earth. The Babylonian account, as transmitted by Abydenus, tells that once men built a high tower where now is Babylon. When it was already close to heaven, the gods sent winds and ruined the entire scheme, and men, having till then been all of the same speech, received now from the gods many languages. Other accounts give the impression that a strong electrical discharge, possibly from an overcharged ionosphere, found a contact body in the high structure. According to a tradition known to the 12th century traveler Benjamin of Tudela, fire from heaven fell in the midst of the tower and broke it asunder. In the tractate Sanhedrin of the Babylonian Talmud, it is said, "A third of the tower was burnt, a third sank into the earth, and a third is still standing." The Tower of Babel story was found in the most remote parts of the world prior to the arrival of missionaries. In those places, thus before the biblical account became known to the Aborigines. For instance, on the island of part of the Pumatu or Tamotu Islands in Polynesia. The people used to tell that after a great flood, the sons of Rada, who survived, made an attempt to erect a building by which they could reach the sky and see the creator god, Vata or Atia. But the god in anger chased the builders away, broke down the building, and changed their language so that they spoke diverse tongues. The question of biblical influence was discussed by the folklorist. They, the natives of Hau, declared that this tradition existed already with their ancestors before the arrival of the Europeans. I leave to them the responsibility for this declaration. All I can certify is that this tradition contains many ancient words which today are no longer understood by the natives. Papa Vu, the sacred book of the Quiche Mayas, narrates that the language of all the families that were gathered at Tulan was confused and none could understand the speech of the others. The Casca, Indian story, makes the result into the cause. The Indians narrate that a great darkness came on, and high winds which drove the vessels hither and thither. The people became separated. Some were driven away. Long afterwards, when in their wanderings they met people from another place, they spoke different languages and could not understand one another. With this exception, the Casca story may refer to any great upheaval and is actually an effect of large-scale migrations. Understand the speech of the others. The traditions of the peoples make the catastrophe the immediate cause of the confusion of languages and the dispersion as well, while the account in Genesis and that given by Abydenus and various other sources connect the story with a certain place in Mesopotamia. The traditions localize it in many different countries. In each case, the entire population of the world is said to have been affected. If the nature of the catastrophe was cosmic, the same occurrence could have taken place in different countries. In this case, the existence of similar traditions in many corners of the globe is of no avail for tracing the migration of ancient tribes. The Arabic tradition makes South Arabia the scene of the upheaval, followed by the confusion of languages and migrations. Similar experiences could have been brought about by one and the same cause in many places. It appears that after the flood of the plain of Mesopotamia became one of the few cultural centers in the world, another flood would have caused the utter destruction of the human race. And this was feared because the memory of the flood a few centuries earlier was very vivid. Observations of the movements of the heavenly bodies may have provided a warning of a new catastrophe, and large structures were built for refuge. But when the event came, the structures were overwhelmed, were destroyed by hurricanes and powerful electric discharges. In the rabbinical concept of the seven earths, molded out of one another in successive catastrophes, the generation which built the Tower of Babel inhabited the fourth earth, but it goes on to the fifth earth, where the men became oblivious of their origin and home. Those who built the Tower of Babel are told to forget their language. This generation is called the people who lost their memory. The earth which they inhabited was the fifth earth, that of oblivion, amnesia. In the ancient Mexican traditions, that it is told that those who survived the catastrophe of Son of Wind lost their reason and speech. The characteristic of this catastrophe was its influence upon the mental or mnemonic capacity of the peoples. The description of, as told by many tribes and peoples, if it contains authentic features, arouses the surmise that the earth underwent an electromagnetic disturbance, and that the human race experienced something that in modern terms seems like a consequence of a deep electrical shock. I'll say the application of electrical current to the head of a human being often results in a partial loss of memory. Also, a loss of speech may be induced by the application of electrodes to specified areas of the brain. Some of the sources assert that the builders of the tower feared a world conflagration. Similarly, the sacred writings of the Burmese relate that when the world is destroyed by wind, the wind begins to blow and gradually increases. At first it only raises sand and small stones, but at length it whirls about immense rocks and the summits of mountains. F. Buchanan on the Religion and Literature of the Burmese. The order of the sun ages of the ancient Mexicans is given differently by different authors, but the most reliable of the sources, the Vatican Codex, wonder why it's the Vatican. What would they know about Mexico? Ixtlilxochitl and Venetia all agree that Echinacea, or the Son of Wind, was the second age, following after the Son of Water, or Echinacea. The tradition that fire from heaven destroyed the tower is also a feature of some of the Mesoamerican accounts. The legend recorded by Pedro de los Rios concerning the foundation of the pyramid Cholula, told you about them pyramids, Cholula, in Mexico, after the waters of the deluge had recorded one of the survivors, Cholula, where he began to build a large structure. It was his to raise the mighty edifice to the clouds, but the gods, offended at his presumption, hurled the fire of heaven down on the pyramid. Many of the workmen perished, and the building remained unfinished. Fraser adds that it is said that at a time of Spanish conquest the inhabitants of Cholula preserved with great veneration a large aerolite, which according to them was the very thunderbolt that fell on the pyramid and set it on fire. Another Mexican tradition recorded by Diego Duran in 1579 tells of giants who built a tower that almost reached the heavens when it was destroyed by a thunderbolt. The tradition was among those collected Cayo in 1912 or 1913. His publication contains the story in the original Polynesian and in a French translation. The question of whether the Greeks transmitted an account of the same events was debated by several writers in antiquity, including Philo of Alexandria, Cyril of Alexandria, and Origen. The writers saw a link between the story of the revolt of the giants and the sons of Alois, who piled Ossa upon Olympus and Pelion atop Ossa in a vain effort to reach the lofty dwelling of Zeus and make a war on the gods, and the account of the construction of the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11:3-8. The earliest allusion to these events is in Homer's Odyssey. Homer ascribes the destruction of the giants to Apollo. Pliny and Macrobius, Saturn 1:19-7, identified Apollo with the planet Mercury. That Mercury and Apollo were alternate names for Stilben, the planet Mercury. Hesiod ascribed the battle with the giants as an immense catastrophe involving the earth and heaven alike. The boundless sea rang terribly abound, and the earth crashed loudly. Wide heaven was shaken and groaned, and high Olympus reeled from its foundations under the charge of the undying gods. And a heavy quaking reached Tartarus. The cry of both armies as they shouted reached to starry heaven. Then Zeus no longer held back his might, but straight his heart was filled with fury, and he showed forth all his strength. From heaven and from Olympus he came forthwith, hurling his lightning. The bolts flew thick and fast from his strong hand, together with thunder and lightning whirling with awesome flame. The life-giving earth crashed around in burning, and the vast wood cracked loud with fire all about, and the land seethed, ocean, streams, and the unfruitful sea. The hot vapor lapped round the earthborn Titans. Flame unspeakable rose to the bright upper air. The flashing glare of the thunder shone, and lightning blinded their eyes, for all that they were strong. It seems as if earth and wide heaven above came together, for such a mighty crash would have arisen if the earth were being hurled to ruin, and heaven from on high were hurling her down. Also the winds brought rumbling earthquake and dust storm, thunder and lightning, and the lurid thunderbolt, which are the shafts of great Zeus. Seneca also referred to the same events in mentioning Jupiter's thunderbolts, by which the threefold mass of mountains fell, and a tradition held that this was the first occasion on which Jupiter used his bolts. Ovid, Fasti 3. The pagans disputed with the Jews and Christians whether Moses took the story from Homer or Homer from Moses, but the common origin of the two accounts was generally conceded. The early writer, Eupolemus, drew on both sources in asserting that the city of Babylon had been founded by those who saved themselves from the deluge. They were giants, and they built the famous tower, Eusebius. From the viewpoint of sequential chronology, the link is plausible. The giants' revolt is said to have occurred not long after Zeus had taken over from Kronos, the dominion of the sky, and it marks the real beginning of Jupiter's dominion. And to end this long tale, this is told in allegorical form in the tale of the wanderings of Adam, the myth of man. Adam, traveling through all 7 earths, is a transparent allegory of the physical and human history of Earth. Midrash Rabbah to Genesis. Exodus, Ginsburg Legends 1. Zohar Ruth, and other sources in Ginsburg Legends 5. It is said that the place where the tower once stood retains the peculiar quality of inducing a total loss of memory in anyone who passes it. Really. The Native Races, San Francisco, 1882, H. Bancroft. The electrical convulsive therapy used in psychiatry for the treatment of certain mental cases is administered by passing current through electrodes on the forehead. Shock treatments conducted through the brain. The electric discharge causes a period of confusion and subsequent complete, though temporary, loss of memory of the events immediately preceding the discharge. A number of patients complain also of consequent disturbances of longer duration, and some of them suffer a patchy retrograde amnesia. See Siskind in Archive of Neurological Psychiatry, Chicago, 1941. That's why I like to read the footnotes, because there can be as much information there, if not more, than the article or the book. The legend recorded by Pedro that when the world is designed differently, Tunisia, the tradition Son of Wind, O.D. Luch had recorded, remained unfinished. Fraser adds, in 1579, tells of the tradition of the Greeks transmitted an account of the revolt of the Jedi upon Olympus. Homer describes the destruction as then Zeus no longer held. The bolts flew. Seems as if earth and wide thunder and lightning, and the was generally conceded. The early writer,
Euponymous,
not of man, Adam, traveling through all seven, Zohar Ruth, and others administered by passive retrograde amnesia. Don't mind me, I like to inadvertently hit things with my mouse for no reason. It's weird. It's like my hand is possessed. I guess it's old age. I'm not crossing the T's and dotting the I's. You know, that's probably my son. He's having his problems in school, but I gotta say, he has really stepped it up, and he proved to me he can do it. He can ace it when he wants to. The problem is all of his studies are just so damn boring. That's why they don't get his interest. He'd rather do things that are fun, and the things that he does that are fun is brilliant. So I don't know. He's still going to graduate, though. He had a little rough patch there, but he's getting through.
Well, that's awesome. He's going to graduate.
One day at a time. Well, he's got to go to summer school. He's a junior. And he's going to make it by the skin of his teeth. Where my daughter is a straight A student.
Of course.
Well, you want to check out another Velikovsky? Let's see one more. I want to pick one more.
The one about the oceans.
I want to pick.
No, okay. The one about the we should let somebody from the chat room pick.
All right.
The one about the oceans? All right, it's short, so we'll do this one, and then we'll let someone from the chat box pick, and you'll have to pick them because...
Well, I only hear rain.
Oh, it's over now. Okay.
Yeah,
you wanted to see the oceans. I think, didn't we see that? No.
Well, you rattled off a couple of different titles that had oceans.
Festival of Lights, Rings of Saturn, and Arrival of the Waters. And then there is... where's the other one at? Oh, Saturn, the Flood, and the Origin of the Oceans. It's 23 minutes long.
Okay.
I think it's 2 videos. So. We get a pizza. Do you want to you want to sit through one more? Or do you Okay.
Whatever.
I don't want you guys to get tired because I know it's late for you. But we got Grouch in here and Adusa, but you guys are muted and I don't know. I guess whenever you want to come in, just turn the mic on and we'll get busy. We'll get down. All right, and then get back up again. All right. All right, here we go. Origin of the Ocean, Saturn, and the Flood. Yeah. Since these lines were written, spectroscopic study. How about that? Okay. Saturn, the ocean, and the flood. Of Saturn I intended already, for some 2 decades, to write in a volume, Saturn and the Flood, in which, as the title discloses, I would endeavor to identify this planet as the prime cause of the greatest of all catastrophes in human history, the universal flood, or deluge. This part of Worlds in Collision was conceived and drafted together with the parts dealing with Venus and Mars. But the elaboration of details was postponed, and other labors claimed my attention. I am still before work unfinished. I will, however, disclose in a few sentences what is the subject of that part of reconstruction of world history. The age that man later called the Age of Kronos, Saturn, was remembered with nostalgia as the Age of Bliss. It was the earliest age of which man retained some, however dim, memories, but farther into the past, the dimness amounts almost to darkness. Saturn was also a more massive body than it is now, possibly of the volume of Jupiter, whereas now proportion is approximately 7:13. At a date that I would be hard put to task to identify, even with approximately about then 10,000 years ago, Saturn was disturbed by Jupiter and exploded. Actually became a nova. The solar system and reaches beyond it were illuminated by the exploded star, and in a matter of a week the Earth was enveloped in waters of Saturnian origin. Told in such brevity, the story sounds fantastic. I had the choice not to mention these events here at all, or to refer to them and ask indulgence on the part of the readers for having said something unusual, and at the same time ask them to wait for a detailed narrative at some intermediate time. I selected the latter. I have already mentioned that the major planets were in some way connected with earlier cataclysms, one of which was the deluge. When in 1946 the manuscript of Worlds in Collision was first offered to the publishers, Macmillan and Company, New York, it contained the story of the deluge and of the catastrophe that terminated the Old Kingdom in Egypt. But at the suggestion of the reader for the publishing company, the book should have concentrated on one event. We compromised and presented the published volume in 2 series of catastrophes. Those that took place in the 15th century before the present era and were caused by near approaches of Venus, and those which occurred in the 8th century before this era and were caused by close approaches of Mars. The unused material was left for collaboration in the 2 volumes, Saturn and the Flood and Jupiter of the Thunderbolt. With this hardly even a summary as told on this page, I should possibly dispel any misconception as to what is the design of my manuscript too slow in the making. As to predictions, I could make several, and I offer them cognizant of the fact that a prediction in science needs to be elaborated on the reasons that led to it. I assumed in the first place that the planet Saturn must contain water to the extent that it is a water planet. It is also possible that water that have enveloped the Earth following the explosion of Saturn was at least partly formed by hydrogen combining with oxygen of the terrestrial atmosphere. There are indications that I intend to discuss in my book on the deluge which point toward a sudden drop in oxygen content in the terrestrial atmosphere. But the fact that comets were observed consisting of water, ice, according to their spectral picture, permits the conclusion that water, ready-made, came from the planetary nova. Actually, in years subsequent to my concept of Worlds in Collision, water was identified as present on Saturn. Further, I assume that sodium chloride, or common salt, as an ingredient of the Saturnian atmosphere, Geophysicists have long wondered as to the origin of salt in the ocean. Sodium could have been derived from terrestrial rocks, but they are poor in chlorine. To some extent, chlorine in oceans could have come from volcanic eruptions, but it would require eruptions on an almost unimaginable scale to produce all of the chlorine locked in the salt of the oceans. The ancient traditions of deluge refer also to the water arriving from space as salty and warm. I have thought also of free chlorine, not combined into salt, on Saturn, but it is possible that vegetable life, at least, is present on Saturn, and free chlorine would interfere with vegetation. The reasons, though not compelling, for this assumption of vegetation on Saturn are also reserved for the detailed discussion. The tradition found in ancient texts refers to innumerable new forms of life in animal and plant kingdom following the flood, which could have been solely a result of multiple mutations. But there exists in ancient lore an ever-reoccurring association of seeds and new plant forms with Saturn, Osiris, Tammuz, and Kronos, all of whom I understand as personifications of the planet Saturn. In recent years, I have chanced to read the view of Joseph Shklovsky, a Russian astrophysicist, that a nova would be a source of cosmic rays even thousands of years after the explosion. Shklovsky and his collaborators offered the suggestion that at some past time the Earth, or the entire solar system, passed through clouds of cosmic rays resulting from a nova star that caused the extinction of various forms of life on Earth, dinosaurs and others. This thought found an echo in me because the same thoughts had been put on paper by me 2 decades earlier, but their assumption that cosmic rays may be discharged by a nova thousands of years after the explosion led me to think that if such is the case, Saturn may still emit cosmic rays, if by now only of low energy. Therefore, when asked at some college gatherings what new prediction I would make, and desirous to tell something that, in case of detection, could not be ascribed to a lucky guess, I volunteered to suggest that there is a good chance that Saturn emits low-energy cosmic rays. This on the assumption that the Russians were right in saying that a nova would still be sending out such radiation after so long a period. Finally, Saturn must emit more heat than it receives from the Sun. Reasons for such conditions of Saturn are at least 2. First, the residual heat of the catastrophe in which Saturn was derailed from its orbit. Second, the radioactivity that resulted from the catastrophe must still be pronounced on Saturn. In addition, Saturn can be regarded as a star and may have some mechanisms that make our Sun burn with intense light. Because the surface clouds of Saturn are cold and the distance of Saturn from the Sun renders the heat from this source very limited, the conclusion was drawn that Saturn must be very cold, frozen to its core. We came to a different conclusion, also concerning the temperature of Saturn below the surface cloud layer. In 1966, Dr. K.I. Kellerman described in Icarus the surprising fact that Saturn, at the wavelength of 21.3 centimeters, shows a temperature of 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which cannot be explained by solar radiation. It will be found of still higher temperature. The rings are formations of less than 10 or 12,000 years old. They must consist largely of water in the form of ice. But since the ancient lore all around the world tells us that it was Jupiter who put these rings around Saturn, they may have some other components too. Since these lines were written, spectroscopic study of the Saturnian rings has revealed that they consist mainly of water in the form of ice. 1966. Sodium chloride and cosmic rays are 2 phenomena still waiting to be investigated. Therefore, I presented to Dr. H. Hess, in his capacity as chairman of the Space Board of National Academy of Science, a memorandum dated September 11th, 1963. Subsequently submitted also to Dr. Homer Newell in his capacity as director of NASA. I included these lines concerning Saturn. Saturn tests should be devised for detection of low-energy cosmic rays emanating from Saturn, especially during the weeks before and after a conjunction of Earth-Jupiter-Saturn. Chlorine should be looked for in the Saturnian spectrum of absorption. His reference here is, interestingly, for certain reasons, G. Kuiper assumed in recent years that Saturn originally was of a mass equal to that of Jupiter. Sky and Telescope, March 1959. It must have been at the very beginning of my occupation with the problems later developed in my books and in not yet published manuscripts that I came upon the question of the origin of salts in the sea and oceans. The common salt is a substantial ingredient of oceanic content, or, said differently, the water of the oceans and the seas contains a substantial solution of NaC1, or sodium chloride, even though our blood and tissues abound in sodium chloride. Man and animals are not adapted to drink salty water, and life on land could develop only thanks to the evaporation of the water from the surface of the seas and the oceans, or to distillation. The evaporating water is free from its salts, falling as rain or snow or dew. It feeds underground sources and also glaciers, and through them the brooks and the rivers and lakes is delivered to our use, usually through concrete tubes and metal pipes. Of the salts of the sea, sodium chloride is by far the most abundant. The provenance of it is, however, a riddle. It was, and still is, assumed that the salts in the ocean originated mainly through the importation from land, having been dissolved from rocks by flowing rivulets and rivers, themselves fed by underground sources, and the same process working on the rocks of the seabed. Terrestrial formations are rich in sodium, and in eons of time, it is assumed, the sodium washed out of the rocks supplied its content to the oceans. The seas evaporate, and the concentration of these salts grows, but the rocks are by far not so rich in chlorine, and hence the problem. From where did chlorine come to contribute its abundance to oceanic water? There is chlorine in source water, but usually not in significant amounts. The proportion of salts in the rivers is very different from their population in the seas. River water has many carbonates, 80% of the salts, fewer sulfates, 13%, and still fewer chlorides, 7%. Seawater has many chlorides, 89%, fewer sulfides, 10%, and only a few carbonates, 0.2%. The comparison of these figures makes it clear that rivers cannot be made responsible for most of the salts of the seas. Therefore, it is also obvious that there is no proper way of calculating the age of the Earth. By comparing the amount of salts in the seas with the annual discharge by the rivers, the most that can be done in this respect is to calculate the rich amount of carbonates in the rivers and in relation to the relatively poor concentration to these salts in the seas. But then there will be no explanation for the rich amount of chlorides in the seas in comparison with their poor concentration in the rivers. Part of the salts could be traced to the washing of lands in the floor of the seas. Chlorine is also known to be discharged by volcanoes, but to account for the chlorine locked in the seas, volcanic eruptions, whether on land or under the surface of the seas, needed to have taken place on an unimaginable scale. Actually, it was figured out on an impossible scale. Thus, it was acknowledged that the provenance of chlorine salts in the seas is a problem unsolved. Paleontological research makes it rather apparent that marine animals in some early age were more closely related to freshwater fauna. In other words, the salinity of the oceans increased markedly at some age in the past. The most obvious and permanent effect of a deluge of extraterrestrial origin on the Earth would be the increase in its water volume and of the place occupied by the seas. Presently, 4/5 of the Earth are covered with water. A stupendous addition of water to the Earth should have decreased, not increased, its salinity, if the water came down in a pure state. But if the Earth was showered by torrents of hydrogen and water, some other ingredients of the Saturnian atmosphere could also have swept across the Earth's orbit. In the Buddhist book on the world cycles, the Visuddhimagga, where the catastrophes that terminated the world ages are described, it is said, "But when a world cycle perishes by water, there arises a cycle-destroying great cloud of salt water. At first it rains with a very fine rain, which gradually increases to great torrents, which fill 100,000 times 10 million worlds. And then the mountain peaks of the earth become flooded with saltish water and hidden from view, and the water is buoyed up on all sides by the wind and rises upward from the earth until it engulfs the heavens." Volcanoes, which were active during the cataclysm of the deluge and during other cosmic upheavals, vomited sulfur, chlorine, and carbonates, and contributed to the composition of the salts of the oceans. Carbonates fell on Earth in large quantities. In some of the upheavals, certainly in one which took place in the middle of the second millennium before the present era, at the very end of the Middle Kingdom in Egypt, an upheaval described in detail in Worlds in Collision. But a major portion of the chlorine in which the oceans are so rich must have come from an extraterrestrial source. My explanation for the origin of a large portion of the salts of the seas suggests that Saturn is rich not only in water, but also in chlorine, either in the form of sodium chloride or in some other combination, or even atomic-free. The last solution of atomic-free chlorine appeared chemically and biologically somewhat difficult to contemplate, because chlorine is a very active element, seeking ties with other elements. Biologically, because it would be damaging to any plant life. Yet there are other indications which point to the possibility of plant life on Saturn. As references, Visuddhimagga, the knowledge that the water of the oceans came from the most part from Saturn, and that the waters were salty, was combined by the Greeks into a metaphor which has the sea being the tear of Kronos. This tradition originated with the Pythagorean school and may derive ultimately from Egypt. Plutarch. According to what the Pythagoreans say, the sea is the tear of Kronos. Clement of Alexandria. This the Pythagoreans believe, comparing the sea to a tear of Kronos. The same is found in a fragment of Aristotle in the edition of V. Rose, 1886, Life of Pythagoras.
This is a shorty.
Star of the Sun. Saturn is not a conspicuous planet in the sky. Were it not for its sluggish movement, an unaided eye would hardly distinguish it from the surrounding stars. In many ancient sources, Saturn is called Sun. The usual name for Saturn in Chaldean astronomy, Alab-Shamas or Alap-Shamas, meaning Star of the Sun. Diodorus of Sicily reported that the Chaldeans called Kronos Saturn by the name Helios, or the Sun, and he explained that this was because Saturn was the most conspicuous of the planets. Hyginus also wrote that Saturn was called Sol. 3. In the Babylonian astronomical text, the word Shamash, sun, was used to designate Saturn. We learn from the notes written by the astrologers that the word sun, we must understand the star of the sun, i.e. Saturn. Ninib was the Babylonian name for Saturn. Ninib, in various places, is said to shine like the sun. He was known as Utgalu, the great son of storms. The Greeks used to call Saturn Phanon, the shining one. If Saturn was always as inconspicuous as it is at present, what could have caused the races of antiquity, as if by common consent, to give to Saturn the appellative Sun, or the shining one? Question mark. The astrologers certainly must have found it increasingly contrary to reason to associate the star that gives us light and life with one of the palest and slowest of the planets. The folk etymology of the Hebrews explained the name Kima as meaning about 100 Kamiya stars. Kamiya stars. The Bhagavad Gita contains the following description of a deity. If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One, the Shatterer of worlds. All that we have considered up to now indicates that Saturn once exploded in a nova-like burst of light. The date of this event I would be hard put to specify, even approximately, but possibly it took place 10,000 years ago. The solar system and reaches beyond it were illuminated by the exploding star. In a matter of a week, the Earth was enveloped in waters of Saturnian origin. And there's his references. Everything he puts down is referenced by all mainstream scientists. It's up so much. All right, that was that. Now we might switch gears here, but we're going to come out and do a little. There's nothing more enchanting than being with someone with a campfire at night. It's got to be the most enchanting thing to do in the summertime.